So we are very excited about the speaker that I'm now going to introduce. This came up, the opportunity to have this came up probably a couple of months ago, I believe, when we learned that Alireza Taghdarreh was going to be here, and there was the opportunity to have a talk by him here. So I'm going to introduce Wallace Kaufman, who was my initial contact, and he's going to say some more about, he's going to do some more specific introductions of Ali. Ali's going to do a talk, and which is going to go roughly to 4. Then we're going to have time after that for a reception and time to visit. There are some books there on the book table, which are going to be available, and we are delighted about that. So I would like to introduce first Wallace Kaufman from Newport, Oregon, and was my initial contact with Ali, and he's going to tell you more specifically, a bit about Ali. So let's welcome Wallace.
Thank you, Tom. I just have very few words, and sometimes introducer gets up and says, I'm going to introduce a man who needs no introduction, and then introduces him. But Ali does need an introduction, and he needs an introduction not because he's not a good speaker. I think you'll find he is a very good speaker, even though this is, by my calculation, only the 7th public talk he's ever given in his life, and it's in English, which is not his language. But it is now. And I want to introduce him because I've been to almost all of the talks he's given in America, 2 in July and then 2 here in Oregon in the past. And I know there are things he will not tell you about himself that you should know. And the first thing you should know is that he's a man of tremendous willpower. Not everybody has willpower. Psychologists are studying willpower now, and they find that some people have it and some people don't. When he was of age to go to university, the universities were closed because of the revolution and all the changes it brought. So he didn't have a chance to go to university. But he went to his own university. He created it for himself, and he taught himself what he needed to know. He studied English by constantly listening over and over and over again, I think sometimes 100 times to the same thing, until he got it perfect and could do the idioms and the speech. So when you hear him, it's not somebody who went to university and learned English. You're listening to a person who taught himself English, and who then had the gall and the guts to decide to translate one of the most difficult works in American literature, Walden. If you've read Walden, or even pieces of it, you know that's 19th century English, and it's long sentences sometimes, and very clever ideas, and lots of plays on words. And he undertook that on his own initiative, just because he loved it. So that's one of the things you need to know. The other thing I think that he won't tell you, because he's a little bit, maybe I'd say, sly about this, is that he's a missionary. But he's not here to convert you. I call him a missionary because he has that passion for doing what he's doing, and for doing the impossible in a way, for changing people's minds and hearts. And that's what we've talked for 10 years, and I know that's the character of his mission. And that's why he's put all this time and work into what he's done. And his kind of missionary is not to convert you to a particular point of view, but to bring together people who would not ordinarily understand each other. And that's what he's doing with his translation of Walden and other things. And when we were in Concord in July, he went and gave a paper to the Thoreau Society and the Walden Institute. We went to visit Emerson's home, the old manse, where Emerson wrote that book, and Emerson also wrote his famous essay, Nature, there. And we had a special tour, and Ali happened to see that Emerson's portrait was on the wall, and underneath it was the chair where Emerson wrote the essay Nature. And we have a wonderful photograph of Ali sitting in the chair, translating, doing the first sentence of his translation of Nature. So he's going to continue on as long as he can to do other things. But with that introduction, I think he'll show you that what I said is true, and you can see him in that light, I think. Ali?
Thank you. But of course I did try to teach myself English, but not enough to read Walden. The reason that I dared to touch this book, I did touch it, of course, but the reason that I dared to continue and dream of reading and finishing and studying it carefully and even translate it is that I had a good friend called Wallace beside me. I would also like to try to thank Wallace for his friendship. Thoreau says, the best thing that I can do for my friends is to be their friend. The only thing I can say about him is that he was a friend, nothing more. And also a Persian sage says, they asked the Persian sage, who is better, a brother or a friend? The sage answered, it is better for the brother to be a friend. Wallace was always kind enough to agree with me and support me, and honest enough to disagree and teach me a lot of new things that I didn't know or I didn't want or I didn't see. I really thank him. Walden is the fruit of cooperation of many people. One of the main characters and one of the main friends who really stayed with me for more than 10 years, over the past few years, on a daily basis, was Wallace. As I was here, I have been here for almost a month, crisscrossing the country 3 times so far. Wallace has been talking to my family in Tehran in order for them to feel less lonely. I do not know a word with a proper definition for what he really does for me. The great Persian poet Rumi, who is now, I've heard, one of the most popular poets in the US, has a very beautiful line. He says, I would like to read it first in Persian, forgive me. He says, آب کم جو تشنگی آور به دست تا بجوشد آبت از بالا و پست. It means seek thirst, not water. Then water will flow from every high and low corner of the universe on you. In order to understand this poem, I ask myself a question. Who drinks more water? One who has more water, or the one who is more thirsty? It was the thirst that I learned and earned from Rumi and other great mystics in my literature that brought me to the water in Walden Pond. Iran has a highly rich literature, but part of its richness lies in the fact that our mystics and poets teach us to be thirsty for the universal truth that also lies in other cultures and languages. That is the reason I spent 10 years of my life on the careful study and translation of Thoreau's Walden. I saw many seas and oceans on my way to Thoreau's home. But even with American literature, within American literature, the ocean in Melville's masterpiece Moby Dick, or the sea in Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, could not match Thoreau's humble pond and quench my thirst. The reason is that Thoreau does not seek a fish or a whale or even water. He seeks thirst in Walden. Thoreau's thirst has created a new world for him and for the whole humanity. He says, I have, as it were, instead of sending his hero to hunt in a sea in our world, he says, I have, as it were, my own sun and moon and stars, and a little world all to myself. Thoreau invites us to his own world. To me, that little cabin, one end of that little cabin, one side of it was here in Oregon, and the other side was there in Tehran. If you remember from Walden, it says we had 3 chairs. I had 3 chairs. One for solitude, and I don't know, anyway, the 3 of them is the maximum number of people who could have in his cabin for society. And I have always thought that 1 chair is in my home, one is in his home. He says, as if I have, as it were, my own sun and moon and stars and a little world all to myself. A little world all to myself. But we must be careful about the meaning of the word little here. What seems little in the eyes of a great soul like Thoreau can ironically be as boundless and wide as a galaxy. How can the world of a man be small who finds the earth like a point in space? He says, this whole earth which we inhabit is but a point in space. How far apart, think you, dwell the 2 most distant inhabitants of yonder spar, the breadth of whose disk cannot be appreciated by our instruments? Why should I feel lonely? Is not our planet in the Milky Way? That's why Walden can be read by 2 people who live on the opposite sides of the globe. It's not just a small cabin. Any kind of separation between us and the rest of the humanity is an indication of the fact that we live in a small world. If we live in the world that Thoreau describes to us, geographical distances, languages, cultures, religions, and no other aspect of our personal life will separate us from the rest of humanity. I think that, like Thoreau, Rumi also believes that the creation of this artistic, mystical world is the key to the expansion of our world and the salvation of our soul. In a similar line of poetry, Rumi says, do not ask me about this world or the other world, for both worlds are lost in the world where I live. Thoreau moves to Walden Pond with the same thirst that Rumi describes in his poem. Walden is the story of Thoreau's thirst for a deliberate life. One part of this deliberate life is his thirst, for example, his thirst for the arrival of the spring. He shows his thirst for the coming of the spring in this sentence. One attraction in coming to the woods to live, was that I should have the leisure and opportunity to see the spring come in. But when did the spring come in? When did Thoreau's thirst discover that the spring has arrived? He carries my soul away, as he described his spring so beautifully in this sentence. The first sparrow of spring, the year beginning with younger hope than ever, the faint silvery warblings heard over the partially bare and moist fields from the bluebird, the song sparrow, and the redwing, as if the last flake of winter tinkled as they fell. The brooks sing carols and grease to the spring. The marsh hawk, sailing low over the meadow, is already seeking the first slimy life that awakes. The sinking sound of melting snow is heard in all dells, and the ice dissolves apace in the ponds. The grass flames up on the hillsides like a spring fire. Was it exactly at this time when Henry discovered his long-awaited spring? Did he really need so many signs to notice the arrival of his long-desired season? No. Like Rumi, Thoreau teaches us that a true thirsty man drinks the first sign, notices the first signs of whatever dreams bring to his life. If we recognize the thirst that exists in Thoreau and his Walden, we would notice that he describes the coming of the spring in a single sentence in Walden when he says, "The cracking and booming of the ice indicate a change in temperature." A thirsty man watches the ice and sees rivers, listens to the cracking and booming of the ice, and hears the songs of 1,000 spring sparrows. Is my friendship with Wallace, is not it a crack in the ice between two nations who have been so separate from each other for such a long time? Is it not an indication? It's just the eyes that Thoreau lent me to discover the opportunity of friendship based on the reading of a beautiful book. Spring will then embrace such a thirst intimately with its sparrows. Thoreau says, "I once had a sparrow alight upon my shoulder for a moment while I was hoeing in a village garden, and I felt that I was more distinguished by that circumstance than I should have been by any epaulet I could have worn." The journey from that crack to the moment that a spring sits on your shoulder with a sparrow. You have to be so patient. If we are not thirsty, we will never notice any spring or any other blessing that the creation bestows on us. As we read in a quote in Walden, when we are not thirsty, one looks and one does not see. One listens and one does not hear. One eats and one does not know the savor of food. Considering the long time it took Thoreau to write Walden, it is not strange it took me as many years to study this great book and translate it into Persian. Thoreau himself says, "Books must be read as deliberately as they were written." Of course, I also translated it. Thoreau is speaking only about reading it. Let me give you just one example of what Thoreau was doing during the long process of writing Walden. Was he just writing? Was he just editing? Was he just a writer? In chapter Solitude, he says, "In one heavy thunder shower, the lightning struck a large pitch pine across the pond, making a very conspicuous and perfectly regular spiral groove from top to bottom an inch or more deep and 4 or 5 inches wide, as you would groove a walking stick." So the lightning struck the tree. This is one moment. "I passed it again." This is a new moment. "I passed it again the other day, and was struck with awe on looking up and beholding that mark, now more distinct than ever, where a terrific and resistless bolt came down out of the harmless sky 8 years ago." From the moment the lightning struck the tree to the moment he says, "I passed it again," 8 years have passed in a single sentence. It's not, Here, I realized that Thoreau was not just editing the book during the long process of reading it. He was actually adding to his thirst and editing the way he looked at the world. It is amazing that 8 years have passed between the time lightning struck the tree and when Thoreau says, I passed it again the other day, in a single sentence. Thoreau does not look at the world around him with the eyes of habit and conformity. As Rumi says, every moment the world renews itself, and we are unaware of renewing ourselves in life. In Walden, Thoreau renews his eyes to watch an ever-changing world with extreme thirst and soulful desire. He says, I have traveled a good deal in Concord. But his journey in a village of only 2,000 inhabitants is more spiritual and poetical than geographical. As Proust says, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. Walden is the story of a true voyage of discovery. There are times that he is not alone and enjoy the company of a beautiful society in his journey. He says, I had more cheering visitors than the last. Children come a-berrying, railroad men taking a Sunday morning walk in clean shirts, fishermen and hunters, poets and philosophers. In short, all honest pilgrims who came out to the woods for freedom's sake and really left the village behind, I was ready to greet. As we can see, Thoreau has absolutely no problem getting along and enjoying the company of all other people. But when you are creating your own world, as he just said, there comes a day when you have to go alone. In the first sentence I heard from Thoreau in my life on a pocket radio, and then I didn't know it belonged to Thoreau, but I knew I loved that sentence very much. Thoreau says, the man who goes alone can start today, but he who travels with another must wait until that other is ready. And it may be a long time before they get off. Philosophers, hunters, children who pick berries, railroad men who take a Sunday morning walk, and no one else knows what world you have in mind as you leave horizons behind. In such pioneering moments when Thoreau is beyond all the boundaries that customs, traditions, habits, and presuppositions put before us, only a poet can meet him. It is no longer time for picking berries, hunting, taking a Sunday morning walk, or even philosophizing. It is time for pure poetry. He says, the one who came from farthest to my lodge through deepest snows and most dismal tempests was a poet. A farmer, a hunter, a soldier, a reporter, even a philosopher may be daunted, but nothing can deter a poet, for he is actuated by pure love. I and Wallace are none of these. We are not hunters, farmers, soldiers, reporters. He is a good poet. That's why we are together here. Every line of Walden speaks something about my life. Who can predict his comings and goings? His business calls him out at all hours, even when doctors sleep. as he goes beyond even philosophers and hunters and farmers and reporters. Thoreau becomes the unique quintessential American poet in my heart. Walden even helped me to see some of the greatest moments in my own literature and culture in a more clear light. Thoreau says, if we respected only what is inevitable and has a right to be, music and poetry would resound along our streets. It's a very beautiful sentence, but like many other sentences in Walden, extremely difficult to catch for me. Thoreau does not mean that we should literally install loudspeakers in our streets to play songs and read poetry to us while we are busy with our hectic life. An actual example from Rumi's real life shows the true meaning of Thoreau's profound sentence. One day Rumi was passing through the goldsmith's bazaar or marketplace when the noise of a goldsmith's hammer suddenly sounded so beautiful to him that he immediately began to dance to its sound in the marketplace. The goldsmith himself was so excited at the scene that he continued to hammer for such a long time that he destroyed all his golden pieces. What Thoreau really means here by this sentence, and Rumi by his dance, and the goldsmith by his hammering, is that if we wash greed off our eyes and respect what is truly inevitable, every sound from all corners of the universe will turn into a beautiful piece of music, even if it is the sound of a hammer. That is the way our streets will echo music forever, and poetry. Here is another example of how Thoreau helped me to understand the profound words of another Persian mystic. As a child, I read that a Persian sage was sitting alone when a man approached him and asked, "Why are you lonely?" The sage looked up and said, "I became lonely when you came." For many years, I was a very young child when I heard this. It was totally impossible for me to understand. We were 30 students in the class, and we were not lonely. We were together. It was only by reading a sentence from Thoreau's Walden that I saw the depth of this profound sentence. Even as an adult, I could not really understand this sentence. It was Walden that helped me to see the meaning. It is where Thoreau says, solitude is not measured by the miles of space that intervene between a man and his fellows. Obviously, the sage was sitting beside a friend from across deserts when the man that approached and sat beside him separated them from each other. I have never seen any poet in the world to be as close as American transcendentalist poets, particularly Emily Dickinson and Thoreau, to the Persian mystics and poets. I can recite many, many more examples. Literature is not really luxury to me. If it cannot connect the souls and hearts and minds of our peoples in a meaningful together, the way I and Wallace have demonstrated as a sample, it is a useless luxury. It is not worth the time that I and Wallace and a few other friends really spent on it. I'm not making a mistake. We are really poetically very close to each other. Why is Rumi one of the most popular poets in the United States, if not the most popular? I told my family that I'm going to a country whose people are close to my heart because they love Rumi. Thoreau wrote his book, many people believe in solitude. And Emily Dickinson did not publish more than a dozen of her poems when she was alive. During her life, she was silent. I always say to myself that I have discovered a beautiful aspect of American literature in silence and solitude. In his book, Representative Men, Emerson says, great geniuses have the shortest biographies. Their cousins can tell you nothing about them. They lived in their writings, and so their house and street life was trivial and commonplace. As a good chimney burns its smoke, so a philosopher converts the value of all his fortunes into his intellectual performance. But this is not the case with Thoreau. He says, how vain it is to sit down, to write, while we have not stood up to live. He does not simply separate himself as an intellectual and send his personal life up into the sky through a chimney. He stands up to live with me. I believe how vain it is to sit down and read the words of writers who do not believe in what they write. I wonder what would the old man from Hemingway's story, I told you, Hemingway's sea did not have enough water to quench my thirst, the way Thoreau's humble pond had. I wonder what would the old man from Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea say when he returns victoriously from the sea, having killed an innocent fish for his personal pride, only to discover that the writer who created him did not have the ability to stand up and live. Truth is obvious. Rumi says, truth is the sun. If you want to see it, do not turn your back on it. As long as Thoreau's books are read across the world, he is alive because he stood up to live. He may have made many mistakes, but he was brave enough to stand up and make mistakes. We can at least see that this is wrong, that Thoreau did. He lives in his books and reveals his real life in his words. Here is another example of how my love and understanding of Rumi brought me to Thoreau. And I felt close to him and to that part of American literature. I found Rumi's purified heart in Thoreau's words. Rumi says, remember just how Emerson was speaking about the intellectual life and intellectuals. Rumi says, in the book of a Sufi, there is no word and letters of education. The book of a Sufi consists of nothing but a heart as purified and white as snow. And Thoreau leaves all the letters of education behind and says, I cannot count one. I know not the first letter of the alphabet. I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. Isn't it? Actually, the word Sufi means purified. The real truth is beyond words. Just as the car that brings us to our destination, we have to get off the car and enter the destination. Words lead according to Rumi, to the truth that lies in silence and the end. Next to his humble pond, away from all oceans and seas of the world, he says, I would drink deeper, fish in the sky whose bottom is pebbly with stars. Whenever I walk among ordinary people on the street, Thoreau is beside me, even as an ordinary man, reminding me that we can drink from the same river whose bottom is pebbly with stars together every night. I found him when he revealed that, like me, he lived in a small cabin when he wrote his masterpiece. I read Walden first when I and my wife lived in a very small room. There was little room for a comfortable life or for enough furniture for us, but there was enough space to hold a copy of Walden and books of Rumi and Sadi with us. The way Thoreau expanded the world for me was through such sentences. Could a greater miracle take place for us than to look through each other's eyes for an instant? But, again, we must be extremely careful not to use our ordinary clocks to measure an instant when it is mentioned in the words of a great soul like Thoreau. He says, could a greater miracle take place for us than to look through each other's eyes for an instant? In my little room, I simply picked up Walden 15 years ago, and I have been looking through Thoreau's eyes for an instant for 15 years. He dedicated his whole life. It was in that instant, that single instant, brought me here and brought many good friends to my life. It was a miracle. He proved that it is a miracle. And he expanded. I crossed oceans. I have crisscrossed this country 3 times so far. By the end of the trip, it would be 4 times. As Emily says in her very beautiful poem, there is no frigate like a book to take us lands away. Sometimes you can comment on the poems of great souls like Emily in the way I did. In what happens to you, clarifies what they really mean. She says, there is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any courser like a page of prancing poetry. It was not in Thoreau's times, they called train the iron horse. It was not the iron plane that brought me here. It was the pages of prancing poetry. Nor any courser like the page of prancing poetry. This traverse made the poorest take without oppress of toll. How frugal is the chariot that bears the human soul. Thank you very much. I don't know how frugal it was, but I spent 10 years of my life on this frugal activity, but it was a delight and really worth it. He filled every crack in the universe, as he said, the cracking and booming of the ice indicated change in temperature. He filled every crack in the universe with a lot of hopes and beauty for me. It was in one of those cracks that I discovered him. Yes, sir.
Well, I want to thank you again for being here, and we are certainly honored to have you.
This is the honor is mine, Tom. Thank you for having me here and inviting me here.
I wonder if you could talk about translation and any particular things that go from English to Persian easily and things that go perhaps more difficult.
When you love doing something, it will be easy for you. And regarding the translation, actually, it's since it's a purely technical work, it takes, concentration and written communication in order to elaborate on the subtleties and the difficulties that naturally occur during the translation of an important, iconic, beautiful book, mystical book like Walden. But the fact that I have spent a decade of my life is that I really recognize that this book is important in your culture and valuable, and I recognize the difficulty of its translation. But then Rumi says, silence is the language of God. The rest is a poor translation. And even what Thoreau wrote was a translation, maybe a poor translation, of what he really went through. Also, Rumi says, referring to a reed flute, in which you blow and play music, he said, the breath that a musician sends inside the reed flute, deserves the reed flute, not the musician. Suits the reed flute, not the musician. Yes, Walden is extremely difficult for translation. I never consented to its publication before I really made sure that I have done my best to make sure that this is the best that I can do. Walden is such a book in which sometimes the mistake you make on a single word may ruin a whole culture. It should really be read as deliberately as it was written. And it would have been, he says, the man who goes alone can start today. But that man, it was not me. I really had to wait until that other is ready. It was impossible, I confess.
But what in particular, or if you can remember any things that were difficult to translate into Persian?
He says, I created my own world. And that world includes a new dictionary and his own definition of the words that he uses. I just showed you when he says little, he says, I created my own little world. And then he says, the earth is but a point in space. Is not our planet in the Milky Way? Why should I feel? That is his definition of little. He always surprises you, shocks you. I have written on the first page of my work, I have many different copies of Walden published by different publishers. On the first page I have written, after many years, in the beginning I used dictionaries to find definitions for Thoreau's words. Now I use Thoreau's Walden to define the words in dictionaries. It is really it's a painful process. I have not published it yet. I'm still doubtful of what world was it I went through, that little world of Thoreau's.
Oh, so you haven't published it yet?
Of course, I have a weblog in Persian. I have put samples of each chapter of my translation on that weblog. 17,000 people have visited that weblog. Even in the United States over the past 1 month, I have received several letters from those who love Walden and asking me when it's going to be published. And among the letters that I have received from Thoreau's fan, Some people have said, now that we see your translation, we believe that it would have been a disaster if we have even touched the book. And it's because I did not do it alone. Even Thoreau did not do everything alone. Right in the beginning of Walden, just as he wants to begin to build his cabin next to Walden Pond, he says, I borrowed an axe. If you remember, he says, I borrowed an axe. It is difficult to start without borrowing. He teaches you have to be thirsty and catch the point when the time comes. It is not necessary to repeat it endless of times. And then the reason that he expresses is very important. He says, it is difficult to begin without borrowing. He means that I can do it. It is a little difficult, but it is more important to allow other people to share an interest in what you're going to do. We try to create a model of friendship and cooperation based on reading a beautiful, meaningful book. And we succeeded. I was brave enough to ask Wallace to lend me his axe, and he was generous enough to do it. And it's interesting that when Thoreau returns the axe to the owner of the axe, because he was reluctant to lend his axe to Thoreau, he said it was the apple of his eye. But Thoreau says that when I returned it sharper. It means it's a pun. Thoreau uses a lot of beautiful puns in Walden. It's a pun. There is a very beautiful pun here. It is not, in fact, the axe which is sharper. It is the eye of the owner of the axe which is sharper. In fact, he's telling him that let something, find someone. It's more beautiful to live together, help each other, pay attention to each other. So that cabin is not really that small.
What was it like to see Walden Pond?
When I saw it, I was surprised how small and ordinary it was. To tell you the honest truth, I did not even walk around it. Because in my eyes, it was not the same thing that I had seen in Walden through Thoreau's eyes. I had seen it through the miracle of Thoreau's eyes. It wouldn't have made any difference if I had watched it for 10 years. The single moment in which Thoreau allowed me to look at that ordinary pond made the difference. I decided to go back and look at it through the book, continue to look at it through the book. Nothing. It was just a body of water.
Thank you for coming here. Thank you for bringing Ollie here. And thank you for crossing the big pond. To come here
Thank you very much for having me here.
House, which is so appropriate to talk about Walden Pond.
It's a very beautiful rain out there. Thank you.
That you're here.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you might read a line from Thoreau and a line of your translation of that line in Persian, so we can hear.
Just the last sentence, there is more day to dawn. It's a very beautiful sentence. Is that there is more? I cannot read it by heart. Maybe I'd better open my computer and find a place.
Use the axe one.
Uh,
How did you translate it was the apple of his eye?
Because Thoreau's sentences are really so eloquent and so precise that I need to open the book and read samples from it. I cannot remember right away what every time I open the book, any sentence that I see seems to be the most beautiful sentence in the whole book. I think it's the last sentence exactly. There is more day to dawn. I mean, Thoreau always believed that it's not just a single day. As many times as we can wake up, we can see more days during the same day that people think is the same. As many times we awake and reawake, we witness a new day in our life. And in Persian we say, سپیده را روزهایی بیشتر برای دمیدن است. From every dawn, more days than a single day can shine and begin. It's not a day for doing business. Perhaps it is also a day to read poetry, or another day to find a new friend, or another day to plant a tree, or another day to, I don't know, write a new poem, another day to help someone. All days can really be contained within a single day.
Could you speak the Persian again?
سپیده را روزهای بیشتری برای دمیدن است. Persian is a slow, very slow musical language. We speak Persian much more slowly than the way you speak in English. In English, sounds are very short, quick. It's inherently a very fast language. But I find it in Walden and find it extremely beautiful.
How is it different than Farsi?
Yeah, what is the distinction between Farsi?
Farsi is what we call our language in Iran. Persian is the word that in English you use to call our language.
Oh, so they're the same.
There isn't any distinction. They are one and the same. They are one and the same.
Well, the reason I asked about whether it had been published is I'm curious about how it's being received by the Iranian people.
Since Thoreau believed that Saadi's soul was alive in his body, and he and Saadi actually lived in the same skin, Iranians already love him very much because they love Saadi very much. Saadi is an extremely popular poet in Iran. They know of him. And actually, many different translators, many different scholars have tried to translate his Walden. A very great scholar even told me, put his pen on the table, said, I held the pen in my fingers and put it on paper and started the translation. And then I dropped the pen and I saw that I couldn't. Of course he could, but he saw that he didn't have enough the time to do the book right. He was honest enough to confess that it demands a huge amount of time and the help of several good friends. Even I have thousands of letters in my inbox on Walden, about Walden, with the questions I have asked Wallace. And he has patiently explained anytime. I sent him questions at night, my time, and received the answer next morning. It would have been impossible for me to translate it, to read it. When you read and understand, the translation, I think, will flow naturally. In Walden, the most difficult aspect of the translation is the understanding of Thoreau's words. Most of the times, Thoreau has multiple intentions and meanings by saying a single sentence. I myself discovered a pun in Walden that nobody had seen before and published in one of the issues of Thoreau Society Bulletin last year. I discovered an allusion, actually, it was not a pun, an allusion to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. A very beautiful pun is this. He says, we should not build a house until We should not build a house until we found a better reason. Of course, Wallace says that I'm stretching it too far, but I think I have discovered a pun here. I believe that by saying until we found a better reason, he's using a very subtle pun here. He's in fact using found in two meanings. First, as the past tense of find, until we found, and then as the first part of another verb, to found. It means until we found, until we saw and until we were able to find a reason from among the reasons that exist. But if we couldn't, we can found a reason ourselves to build our own house. We do not have to wait, and it's very subtle.
But there's a good question. How do you translate that into Persian? Because found and foundation may not be the same.
Maybe here, of course, it loses its the literary beauty that it carries is in a single word in English. Well, I cannot translate. I just enjoy it. That's it. I honestly enjoy it.
This comes back to your favorite saying from Frost. That poetry...
Yes, that's right. But Robert Frost says, poetry is that which is lost in translation, but not the message. Even poetry exists for a more important message. The words, it's not, Thoreau did not really want only to write poetry. Of course, he wanted to write it as beautifully as he could. But then, when people read my translation, one of the things that my translation can do is that, okay, here is a very beautiful book. Let's learn English and read it in its original language. Let's continue the journey. It's an ongoing journey. A beautiful poem is worth learning a new language. Yes?
Can you speak to us of Omar Khayyam?
Oh, yes.
Which reminds me, let me interrupt that just a minute. Ali has translated about 50 verses of
Yes,
Omar Khayyam.
of which I loved only less than 10 of them.
And there are a few copies of the book that he did back there. It's very beautifully done with not only his translation, but with the calligraphy. So they're $12 a piece, and if you want one, they're there.
Yeah, master Persian calligrapher did the calligraphy. It is very beautiful. Well, you may know that Omar Khayyam is one of the greatest mathematicians in the history of science. And he is one of the greatest mathematicians in our history. Actually, the calendar that we use today is the one that Khayyam designed for us and calculated for us. And it is, I don't know why, I have not done any research here, but they say it's the most accurate or one of the most accurate calendars used in the world. For hundreds of years, we have marked the beginning and end of our year on our calendars. We have based it on Omar Khayyam's calculation. So it's the way he tells us that here your new year begins and here it ends. But it's very interesting that in a very beautiful poem he says, and this is my own translation, a perfect literal word for word translation. The man who's calculated our calendar and the beginning and end of our years so precisely and accurately says, in the circle we come and go round, beginning and end may never be found. No one breathes a true word around, where we start and to where we are bound.
Is that
That's,
your translation?
it's my translation, yes.
The true translation.
Yes.
Yeah. Of course, Fitzgerald's translation, as an Iranian, Iranians are very fanatic about their poets and poetry. And as an Iranian who loves his poets a lot, I can say that I enjoy Fitzgerald's translation as much as I enjoy Khayyam's original words. They are beautiful, really beautiful. It's not, you cannot match a single poem with the exact single original poem. But on the whole, he captures Khayyam's spirit very much. And which brings us back to Robert Frost's famous dictum that says translation is that which is lost. Poetry is that which is lost in translation. So it is not. And sometimes poetry gives birth, and translation gives birth to many, 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 many more forms of the same poetical idea that simply formed in the mind of the original poet. See, Rumi has been, people, scholars, poets, translators in the West have been translating Rumi for 150 years. So it's not lost, it's just, it's the beginning of many, many, many more versions of Rumi's poems in your language. And each time, right now, in Frost's country, Rumi is the most popular poet in the United States through translation.
What about Farooq Farooq?
She is one of our greatest contemporary poets, yes.
I love her poetry.
I'm very glad and honored that you like her. But I found, although our contemporary poets traveled to the West and were familiar with your culture and are contemporary to the modern world, they have not yet managed to reach the level of popularity that Rumi from 800 years ago have reached.
Why is that? He's an ecstatic.
Yeah.
He's the ecstatic.
It's because they have reached the truth, the universal truth that is not imprisoned in time.
Yeah.
And also, you said something the other day about the language of Rumi being still readable.
That is very true.
As Shakespeare is not.
No. The language of Rumi, more than Rumi, even Omar Khayyam's poems are easily read and understood even by our students in elementary schools. It's an extremely, it's a very Omar Khayyam, Sadi, and in many of his poems, Rumi writes in a language which is so close to our, despite their depth and despite the huge meanings, philosophical and mystical meanings that they carry, their language is deliberately so close to our daily life and the understanding of the ordinary people. They did their best to keep it as close as they can.
So the classic version in which Rumi is written is still close enough to
It is,
Farsi
yes.
to
If he is the most popular poet in the United States, I promise he is more so inside his own country. Yeah.
Something you might put on your calendars too is that Pauline is going to be here on June 4th. So she's going to be talking about Rumi.
Okay, and here's another poem from Omar Khayyam in my translation. He says, "O friends, when you meet in friendship and trust, you should remember the friend that you lost. Drinking together when his turn arrives, fill up his glass and pour it on his dust." Okay, remember me on that day, please.
Mercy.
Oh, thank you very much for having me here. It was a real pleasure.
Ali will be here. He will be here for a little while for some more conversation if you would like. you said, there are some books back here. There's some refreshments. Please help yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you.